Okay, this is Block 7, The Greatest Generation, Section 2, Rise of the Dictators, with the section beginning Japan's invasion of China. As we saw, in 1931, Japan attacked and conquered the Chinese province of Manchuria, but Japan was not finished with its designs on the Chinese, on China. China was a huge country, but very poorly governed. It had a very weak central government. Local warlords battled for control over provinces. There was constant communist uprisings in the vast, internal hinterlands of China. But China has huge amounts of natural resources, and that's what the Japanese were after. So in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937 near Beijing. And they are absolutely brutal. There's aerial bombing and just the regular movement of armies. Japanese soldiers in the Chinese city of Nan King perpetrated a horrendous war crime. It's called in history the Rape of Nan King. They firebombed this train station, for example. This is one of the most famous photographs of the 1930s. This was taken moments after a bombing of a train station in Nanking. This little baby is burned, his mother was killed, and he's sitting there next to the tracks around this burned out train station just screaming. It's hard to look at. The Japanese were brutal. Here's a Japanese soldier bayoneting a Chinese prisoner to death. And the Japanese army swept through coastal China. But China is so huge, and China has so many people in it, that even after 4 years of fighting, Japan controlled the coastal regions. Here's Manchuria, up here in the northern part of the country. And pushing inland along some of the rivers and down some of the cities along the coast down here on the bottom. But there's millions upon millions of Chinese people here in the interior too, and Japan simply does not have a big enough army to hold all of China at once. And it just becomes this ongoing drain of man and material as the Japanese try to conquer China, and they are constantly foiled by just the vast size of the nation of China. China has two men kind of leading the opposition to Japanese rule. They both are going to play a major role in Chinese history after the war. Here is Mao Zedong, and here is Chiang Kai-shek. They were fighting a civil war with each other when the Japanese invasion came. Mao is a communist, Chiang is a nationalist, non-communist, and they were busy fighting each other for control of China when the Japanese invaded. Upon the invasion, the two of them decided to through a lot of negotiations, decided to put their differences behind them and focus on fighting off the Japanese until the Japanese were kicked out, and then the two of them could resume their civil war for control of China. We are going to see, when we look at the Cold War in Block 8, what happened in China between Mao and Chiang. Roosevelt's reaction to the Japanese invasion of China is he wants to kind of put a strong foot forward. So he purposely starts by ignoring the Neutrality Acts. If we remember from earlier, the Neutrality Acts required the president to recognize a state of war existed between two powers. So the first thing Roosevelt does is does not admit that there is a state of war that exists between China and Japan, and because he does not admit it, none of the Neutrality Acts are enforceable. That all of the Neutrality Acts were predicated upon the president saying there is a state of war between Japan and China. Roosevelt refuses to say that there is a state of war between Japan and China, and so his hands are a lot less tied. His goal is to continue to supply the Chinese with goods, materials, and weapons. Roosevelt has a soft spot for China. Many Americans have a soft spot for China. Roosevelt wishes to continue supplying the Chinese who are fighting the Japanese, and to do that he has to ignore the very neutrality acts that he himself had signed. After ignoring these acts, Roosevelt thinks that the country is ready for a little bit, a push, if you will, on its isolationism, and gives a speech that came to be known as the quarantine speech. What a quarantine is,
you were doing great.
I'm still doing great. I'm just trying to find a little smartboard thing, but thank you. What a quarantine is, and I'll wait for the start little thing to load up here. What a quarantine is if you have bacteria, for example, and you quarantine it, all it means is you put a big fence up around it so the bacteria can't get out. If there is a country that is acting badly, you can quarantine it by putting a big so-called fence around it, not letting anybody in or out. What Roosevelt tries to do is quarantine Japan. He says aggressive countries like Germany, aggressive countries like Japan, aggressive countries like Italy must be quarantined by the rest of the world. They must be forced to pay for their aggressiveness. He is not advocating for war. He is advocating for economic sanctions, embargoes. Roosevelt says, Germany, Italy, Japan, no one should sell them anything that they could use in order to continue their aggressiveness. And if you did trade with them, then you should be punished too by economic sanction. FDR believes that the American people are kind of in line with him on this, but he fundamentally misreads the American mindset. The American reaction to his quarantine speech is overwhelmingly negative. The American people say to Roosevelt, you are just going to pull us into another war. You are going to make our boys go across the Pacific Ocean this time to fight a war that we don't want. Mr. President, what are you thinking? We did not elect you to get into another world war here. Roosevelt is forced to retreat from his statements and find less direct ways of punishing the aggressor country. So even in 1937, even with this brutal rape of Nan King, even with all of these things, the American people were not supportive of war. They are not even supportive of war when the Japanese attack and sink an American gunboat in China. This is the Uss Panay, and the Uss Panay, as we know, China was a mess of a country. It was lawless, it was corrupt, it was poorly run, and USS Panay is a naval vessel tasked with protecting American trade in China, whether it's from bandits or this group of thugs or that group of thugs. It was left behind in the city of Nanking to evacuate American citizens in Nanking when the Japanese attacked it. The Japanese attacked Nanking. The USS Panay takes off the last American civilians. They told the Japanese they were there. They painted enormous American flags on top of the ship. They flew enormous American flags from the masts and proceeded to try to evacuate these American civilians from the path of the Japanese army. Japanese aircraft attacked anyway and sank the Panay, killing 4 people and wounding about 55. The Japanese apologized. They claimed that they thought it was a Chinese ship. They paid the families of the people who were killed. And while it aroused anger in the United States, most Americans were relieved that this incident did not lead to war. What it really served to do in terms of American-Japanese relations is it makes the United States look weak in Japan's eyes. To have your ship attacked is an insult, and to let an insult get away with an apology and a payoff to the Japanese mind in 1937 is the sign of a coward, is the sign of weakness. And the Japanese look at this and say, we can really kind of take advantage of any American citizens that we find, and they did. That American citizens that were working in China, either as missionaries or as teachers or as businessmen, were routinely captured and humiliated by the Japanese army. They were stripped down, they were paraded around naked, they were whipped before being let go. And since the United States did nothing about it, it serves to make Japan think that the United States is a paper tiger. And think about what that term must mean. That the United States is a paper tiger. It looks big and scary, and it looks big and powerful, and it looks strong, and it looks vicious, but in the end, it's only made out of paper. And that is what the Japanese are going to believe about the United States, and it informs their strategic thinking through Pearl Harbor as well.